Hello, everyone. Welcome to the TheMsTexasShow. This is the show where we highlight our amazing lives of our survivors from domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking. And we also invite our community leaders to come on and share their resources with the communities. Under the segment Military Time, we invite our military and veterans to share their experiences during and after their services. We also have another segment, Beauty for Ashes. This is the segment where we invite our pageant sisters, our artists, such as musicians, dancers, actors, last but not least, our ambassadors who are survivors but now voicing their story and active in the community to bring hope and healing. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our special guest today, Lisa. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm honored to be here. I'm
And this I know this show is pre-recorded, and usually we pre-record and air it. But I just want to mention today is Valentine's Day, and Lisa and I are sitting across the country via Zoom. And thank you so much for your dedication.
oh, you're
Um,
welcome, and thank you for yours as well. Here it is, So happy Valentine's Day.
Happy
Put out some
Valentine's
hearts
Day.
out to you.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna do a little bit introduction of Lisa. Lisa has 3-4 pages of bio, but she has done so much, and I'm so proud of you, Lisa, for where you are right now and helping others. And like I mentioned about bringing hope and healing, and I saw that's what the book is for. So I'm gonna speak a little bit about her and then hand the mic to her and let her tell us her story. So Lisa is an author, a child and mental health advocate, and she is the Massachusetts National Ambassador and Regional Director for the New England area for NASCA. She's also a public speaker. She's a blogger and radio personality. Her book is called The Unspoken Truths of Memoir, a child story, an adult journey towards healing. She's a wife. She's a mother of three. She's a grandmother of three, and we just chatted. You look so young,
Well, I
So
appreciate you saying that.
maybe another session will bring you on to chat, like the secret about how to remain useful, right?
No, that sounds good.
So Lisa gained her voice by validating her story, and she healed through the process. She was able to see the view and the perspective of the people in her life. And that is where she found forgiveness. Lisa is the everyday woman with the extraordinary gift for giving and is full of compassion. She has worked with disabled children, adults, teaching life skills and writing. She also served as a mentor to young women in a lockdown facility, teaching journaling, poetry, art therapy. Taking the journey with her today and see how this story unfolds. Her ability to survive as well as thrive through her silent word of the treachery truth truly is an incredible journey filled with such inspiration and never-ending hope. This is lovely, and I know that you are the host for NASCA radio show, and you are the national ambassador for the Massachusetts. I was on the NASCA show as well, and I'm the ambassador for Texas. So
Oh, that's awesome.
kudos for
That's
all the
great.
hard work that you do.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, she has been on so many different radio shows, and so I'm gonna hand the mic to Lisa and tell us, a little bit about you and how did this all get started.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, again, thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. It's always so good to be out here and talking about our stories. And, it's just so important that people hear that they're not alone. So that was one of the biggest reasons I started speaking publicly. So to backtrack slightly here, I am the Massachusetts National Ambassador, Regional Director for NASCA, and NASCA is the National Association of Adult Survivors of Child Abuse. So yes, I am a survivor. My story, which is the unspoken truth, I use my story and my title as a platform to speak publicly about child abuse, domestic violence, mental health, which is such a key factor to many of the things that happen, and of course, sexual abuse. There's a little bit of everything that goes into my story. My story is complex. It's not just, that one thing happened. Many, many things happened and contributed to, my childhood and upbringing. So to start at the beginning, when I start my book, I start as a 6-year-old child, and I smile at that because, the youth, the resilience of youth, the innocence of youth. When I think back to those moments, the good moments, because we did have good moments before it fell apart, they do still make me smile, because that is the core basis, of a family. It was my parents, my brother, and myself. I was the baby of the family. And my mom struggled with mental illness. So from a very young age, I was very aware of her mental illness, the way she acted, the way she presented herself, because she would change rapidly. So anyone who is familiar with mental illness, that the cycling can happen, and it can be scary, especially for children, because they don't totally understand it. But I was always very aware of it. So my brother got sick with leukemia. And unfortunately, he passed away at the age of 9, and I was 6 years old. And that's really where I start the basis of my story in writing, because that's when my whole world fell apart. My brother was my guardian angel, my savior. He always protected me and shielded me from the dark times in our home. So there was domestic things happening because of my mom's illness, because my dad had a really hard time understanding what was happening with her. So there was a lot of arguing, there was a lot of yelling, there's a lot of things going on. My mom would, change her moods and her cycles, continually. So it was very difficult. And once she lost, my brother, she completely fell apart. And that's when everything changed, because both my parents were together but went into separate directions. My dad threw himself into workaholic. He was out and he would drink and he would do those things. My mom was in a deep depression, and then just went inward, and she could never overcome the fact of losing her child, which of course, how can you understand that, a parent loses a child, that's devastating. Now add mental illness to that piece, and trying to cope and then raise a small child. And, it's back in the era of the 70s. So of course, when you look at the 70s, everything was silent. Nobody talked about anything. What happened in the home stayed in the home. And, outside of that, you smiled when you walked out that door. And, that's the way it was. So my mom was very alone in her struggle. People did not understand. Her family didn't understand, and she would struggle daily. And she took herself off her medications quite frequently. And when that happened, she would go through these unbelievable cycles of mania, which extreme highs and then extreme lows. And as a small child, I was in the middle of all of that. So losing my brother was devastating enough. Feeling like I've lost my parents in the mix of that was even harder. And mind you, I'm 6 years old and I'm trying to understand everything, and I'm terrified. And as time went on, my home got very dark. I called my house the house of horrors, and that sounds awful, but it really was. I mean, because you never knew what was going to happen. I was always living on the edge. And, my mom, as things went along, it got darker for her, and she started becoming verbally abusive towards me. And then that went to emotional abuse, and then physical abuse. So my mom would become extremely violent in a moment's notice. She could be doing one thing and high as a kite, and then the next minute she's down low, and then she's angry and violent. So I rode that roller coaster with my mother every single day. And, I went off to school and I had to put on a brave face, and then I would come home, and this is just always so profound for me when I think about this. When I would come home, I would always stop at the bottom step and I would wait. And I would prepare myself. And I was young, so say maybe 8 years old at this time. And I'm preparing myself to walk through that door because I didn't know which mom I was going to get. Am I going to get the sad mom, the angry mom, the mean mom, or the mom who is so high and manic that she's dancing, screaming, and doing all kinds of, outlandish things. And I do use the word crazy when I speak. So for some people, when they hear that word crazy, they feel like, you shouldn't be using that term. But my mother used that term when she spoke about herself. So I grew up hearing that term, I'm crazy, I'm crazy. She would always say those things. So I do use that term crazy sometimes because it was the way she felt about herself, and which is sad to think that somebody with mental illness, on top of all of what they feel like everyone portrays them as just crazy. It's much bigger than that. It's, they're struggling daily, and she struggled daily. But so going back to, walking up those steps every day, and my little stomach would flutter, and I would feel sick, and I'd come through the door, and I was greeted in so many different ways. And it was terrifying. It really, really was, growing up in the unknown, and then expect to thrive and learn and do all these things. And I was in a cloud most of the time. And, in writing my story, I do write it that way. My book is a little bit choppy sometimes because I wrote it from the child's perspective. And I wrote it from those moments, like I call them the blank area, because I would blank out in a sense, and I would, feel like, I can't even hear what someone's saying. And then it would all come, then I would hear something happen. I'd be, oh, okay, I have that, but I don't have this. So that's the kind of how I lived my life growing up, because of the trauma and the abuse. It really did a lot of damage, and I lived in silence. So, and that's a key thing, that many of us who have been abused, you live in silence. You hold it so tight, and you don't let anyone know. So you're living two worlds at the same time. And it was very, very difficult to grow up in such a way. And, as time went on, my dad left. My dad couldn't take it anymore, and he just walked out one day. And at that time, I was around 11 and a half years old. And it was really brutal in our home at that time. My parents, when they were around each other, they were volatile. They fought. And my father never put a hand on her, but the verbal part was really brutal. And she was just as brutal, if not worse, the things that she would say. And then she would throw things. My mother, when she was angry and violent, she would throw things. She would, whatever she can get her hands on. So like she would go full bore. So my dad just decided that he had had enough, and he left. But unfortunately, he left me. He left me there. He left me in the home with my mom, completely out of her mind, so sick, and he walked away. And that's when the abuse took a whole nother level for me, because she really took a huge turn for the worse, even darker, if you can imagine, even darker. But it got very, very dark. And then that is when a second abuser came into my life. And he was a young man in our neighborhood who was with us was in our neighborhood many years ago and left and came back. And he came to our door one day, and interesting, he was friends with my brother back in the day. And he actually pulled a knife out on my brother as young children. And my dad kicked him out of the neighborhood. And then he ended up moving away, gone for so many years. And now he shows up back at our doorstep. And he unfortunately had the same things going on as my mom. He was mentally ill, and he had abuse in his life. And he came into our home, and he whittled his way in there, telling my mom, he was sick like my brother. He needed someone to help him. He knew all the right things to say. And my mom would always take in people. My mother took in homeless people. My mother took in, people walking down the street, hitchhiking. My mother just, in her mind, always needed people around. A lot of people like her who were mentally ill. So there was always different types of people in our home coming and going. And that was scary in itself, because I was preyed upon by them as well. And I was always like under the gun, worried and scared and thinking, what's going to happen to me next? And when this young man came into our home, he said to my mom, I want Lisa to be my girlfriend. At that time, I was 12. First of all, I hated him what he had done in the past. And I didn't want a boyfriend. I was a kid. I was a damaged kid. And the last thing I wanted was a boyfriend in my life. My mother thought it was the best idea ever and said to him, yes, you definitely can date my daughter and, be a part of our lives. And, my mother had this thing with young boys because they all reminded her in some sense of her son, what she lost. And it was difficult for her to rationalize the reality of what other kids and other young men. That was not her child, but she always felt in a sense they all were like, they could replace in a sense. And that was just, very clouded and not the truth. So he came into our home and he decided he was taking over. And not only did he, yes, it was really interesting time because nobody stopped it, like my dad knew it was happening, family knew it was happening. And this young man came in, he was older than me. He was like 15 at the time. And he kind of claimed the house and claimed me along with it. And he said to me, you will be my girlfriend. And I said, no, I won't be your girlfriend. I don't want that. I'm a kid. And he told me I didn't have a choice. And he told me that, the only other choice you have is death, pretty much is how he put it to me. And that's when the verbal abuse started. He beat me down in so many ways verbally and telling me nobody cared about me. Nobody loved me. I was a piece of garbage. I was lucky that he even wanted me as his girlfriend, all these things. And he would daily just do this to me every single day. And boy, that messes with the kid's mind. And think about a mind who's already been damaged. I lost my brother, traumatized, being abused by my own mother, never understanding fully of her, her mental illness, because once again, nothing was ever talked about. So now here I am, going, what am I going to do now? Like, I'm stuck. I literally was stuck and I didn't know how to get out of this situation. And I remained silent out of fear, out of just everything in the damage. And I always go back to that damage because that damage of a child being abused for so long really, really does a number. And you just can't think about the bigger picture. You're in the moment 24/7 of just trying to stay alive, trying to stay safe. I would like try to fly under the radar with my mother because her violence, was just so horrific. My mom, would be angry. She would throw knives at me, forks, spoons, anything she get her hands on. She had these big, thick shoes and she would, crack me in the head with it like it was nothing. So it was violent. And, in one of the worst case scenarios, my mother took a meat tenderizer. Have you ever seen, the meat tenderizers with the sharp edges? For, to beat onto meat, to tenderize it. So she did attack me one time with the meat tenderizer. And I had these marks on my back for over a month. It was so violent and so scary. So those are the things that I had to deal with leading up to now this other abuser coming in to say, he's going to claim me. And he went from the emotional abuse to physical abuse. Then he started beating me. I was getting beaten up all the time by him. And my mom would be in the other room smoking her cigarettes, drinking her coffee, crying, because this was her pattern. She would cry, she would smoke, she would talk to herself, listen to her music, and oblivious to what was happening in the next room. I'm getting, beat up. I'm getting, verbally abused every single day. And then one day he decided it was time and he raped me. And I was 13. And it was brutal. And he was very torturistic in his abuse. He really, he would talk a lot about Satan and talk about, he would, recite these crazy things. And he was very, very torturistic in the things that he did. And he seemed to take pleasure more in the torture than the actual sex. And, every time it happened, it was worse every single time. He would come to a whole new level of abuse. And he was just so nasty and so mean and so calculating. And I would just endure. I would endure. And, you know, I hit a point in my life where I woke up one day and I said, I'm done. I can't live this way anymore. I'm waiting to be saved, you know, the child waiting to be saved. And I waited and nobody came. Nobody saved me. And I felt I was at the end of my rope, and I decided that I was going to kill myself. And I wasn't even 14 years old yet. And how sad is that to say out loud, to think how many children out there at this very moment feel that exact same way that I felt back in the day. And I decided I was going to do it. And I did make a plan. And my plan was to go up to the waterfall near my house, and I was going to jump off. There was rocks below, and I knew in my heart, I was like, it would be quick and I'd be done. And I thought about, like, boy, if I do this, I could be with my brother, and I can go to a place where no one can ever harm me ever again. Nobody can touch me. And it was enticing to think about peace, to think about safety. I lived in such fear for so many years in the unknown that the thought of safety was like, wow, like, you know, this is what I want. And I went up there and I stood up at that waterfall and I looked down and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then all of a sudden I heard something, and I heard a voice, and it said, no, stop, don't do it. And it caught me off guard. And I looked around and nobody was there. It was just me. And I heard it again, no, stop. And I took a step back, and I was like, everything just was like a blur at that moment. It went into slow motion. And I felt as if it was my brother, you know, my guardian angel saying to me, you know, don't do it, Lisa. You're going to make it. It's going to be okay. At some time, it's going to be okay. Don't give up. And I actually stepped back off that ledge. And it was, as crazy as this sounds, here comes my mother, who my mother was oblivious to everything going on in my world. But here she is at the bottom of the waterfall at that moment that I was going to jump. And she said, she's screaming at me, Lisa, don't get down right now. Like, she knew what I was going to do. It was a very powerful moment. And I did come down. And of course, when I came down, my mother is screaming at me. She's hitting me. She's bantering and dragged me all the way back home. And she yelled at me the whole way home. And I'm like, it was so crazy that I couldn't even comprehend what was really happening. So when we get to the steps of my house, all of a sudden, she goes back to this blank stare, stops talking, and we walk up those steps quietly into the house. She never confronted me about it, never said another word about it. I went into my bedroom and I just laid on the bed and I cried my eyes out. And that silence is just so deadly in so many ways, because, you know, the confusion of like, okay, she came, she was there, now she's gone again. You know, my mom, I would see her in these little tidbit moments and then she was gone. And that silence truly is damaging. And one of the biggest reasons I decided to break my own silence and tell my story, because I don't want to see other people go through what I've been through. If I could save a child, one child, I've done something. If my story helps people realize what's going on, then I've done something, you know, really good in regards to saving children. And if my story helps somebody else gain a voice and share their own story so they could heal and get to where I am, then that's magnificent. That's like the topping on the cake. You know, you're saving children, you're helping people heal just by sharing a story. And that was my motivation. And, you know, from that moment on, after that day when I wanted to die, something changed inside of me. And I dug deep, like really, really deep inside my soul. And I thought, you know, how am I going to get myself out of this? I deserve better. You know, I'm worth it. And I started to change my mindset, and I fought myself daily to change my mindset. And then my attitude towards my so-called boyfriend changed as well. I started to become more bold, a little more brave. You know, I took my beatings, I can tell you that, tremendously because of my boldness. But I decided if I'm going to fight, then I'm going to fight, and I'm going to fight for myself wholeheartedly. And I did. And my saving grace, and this sounds awful, is that my mom left the house one day and didn't come back. And I called my family, and you know, they came for me and brought me to my grandparents, and we waited all night to try to find out where my mother went and what happened to her. My mom tried to commit suicide, and she came home all sliced down her arms. She wanted to die, and she ended up going to the hospital. And my mom was definitely a revolving door patient, you know, in the hospital, in the psychiatric unit, because of her illness. So my saving grace came at her expense in a way, because it got me out of that home. It got me away from my other abuser. I was able to continue to push away from him and get out from under his thumb. And it was very difficult to do. But not being in that household under the thumb of my mother and him at the same time was my ticket to freedom, to begin, you know, to try to heal somewhat. But with saying that, you know, we went from my house to my grandparents' house. My grandparents' house, you know, my grandparents were incredible people, but there's a lot of dysfunction there as well. And my mom came back to be there as well. So I was still dealing with her abuse. So going into my teenage years, you know, I finally was able to break free from my abuser, but at the cost of two things. He beat me so severely on the last day that I saw him, and he raped me so brutally that a month later I found out I was pregnant, and I was 14. He beat me so bad, he smashed my head against the train tracks, and just the rape was horrific. And from that rape came a pregnancy. And at the age of 14, I'm saying to myself, first of all, I don't want a child. Second of all, the last thing I would ever want is a child with somebody like him. And I was a child. I go back to, you know, the damaged child. And I had an abortion. And my dad, you know, was like, you're not having this baby. And my mom, on the other hand, wanted me to have this baby. She wanted this baby. And I said, no, Mom, I'm not going to have this baby, because that's not what I want. That's not the way I would want to ever have a child. So I did. I had an abortion, and that in itself was devastating too. It was very sad for me. You know, I've always had a love for children, but that's not the way I ever wanted, you know, my life to go, to be 14, have a baby by being raped. That's not where I wanted to be. And so I did make that choice. And, you know, I don't regret that choice. It was the right choice for me at that time in my life, because I was just a kid. And from that point, I felt my whole life changed after that. I had a whole new focus. My focus was to get out, to get through school, get an education, find my way, and I wasn't going to let anything stop me. So I started in working. I got a little job, and, you know, I was focusing on school. And my life was still very difficult because I was still living with my mother. And not only was we living still with my mother, at this point now at my grandparents, we're sharing a bedroom. Imagine being 14, sharing a bedroom with your mom, somebody you most of the time despise because of her illness. And it's awful to say it that way, but that's how I felt back then. I hated my mother. I hated for what she did to me. I hated her illness. And now I'm forced to share a room with her. I'm forced to share a bed with her. That's just mind blowing in itself. I'm a teenager. The last thing I want is any of that. But I had no choice. The house was overfilled. It's what it was. And, you know, my grandparents did the best that they could for what the situation was. And I give it to them, because my grandmother, Rose, was blind, but the most incredibly tenacious woman, I have to say, and smart, and just, she always offered such incredible advice. And she would always encourage me to keep going. And, my grandfather was an alcoholic, and, he would work hard, he would play hard. And that was very difficult in the home. So I'm dealing with that, and I'm dealing with my mom, and now I'm in a room with her, and I'm trying to succeed in life. And all these things are just so heavy and so, adult for a 14-year-old, but I endured it, and I endured it in silence. People around me didn't ever really know my story. My peers, they didn't really know the full extent of my story. I hid it really well. I hid it to survive. And that was my fuel. That was my, what pushed me to continue to push forward and do things. And I did. I kept going. But unfortunately, they always say your past catches up with you. And that's the truth, because you can only hold on to silence and pain for so long, and it has to come out somewhere. It has to. I mean, your body can only hold it, and then it starts seeping. So, when I think back now, it was seeping at a much younger age than I thought, even though I was hiding it so well. I did have some difficulties in the workforce. I did have difficulties in learning. I realize now that I definitely had some developmental disabilities due to abuse and trauma. By the way I thought, by the way, I would see things and read things, and, math was always a very difficult thing, because if the number said 1, 2, 3, I could see it 3, 1, 2. And I would look at it 3 or 4 times and go, okay. And so everything was harder for me. And, I just kept pushing and enduring. And I went to a secretarial college after high school. I wanted out. I wanted a career. I wanted out. And that's what I did. And I forged forward. But after I was married and had children, that's when I fast forward to that part of my life. That's when the silence came back to kick me in the butt in a very major, major way. As a young mom of 3 kids, my husband working hard, we're trying to raise this family. I'm still dealing with my mom, who very sick, very big part of my life, always putting demands on me and just making it very difficult. And I was trying to balance it all. And I started to crack, and I started to crack in a lot of different ways. I struggled just to get through my days. I was angry for, I couldn't verbalize my anger, but I felt the anger, and I just started falling apart.
So let's, if I may, Lisa, let's section this. So I
Sure.
did make a lot of notes to ask you the questions. So let's segment, the childhood until that, the second part that you're starting with the kids. And we're gonna take a quick commercial break, and then we'll come right back. And I'm gonna ask you the questions about the childhood, from the physical, the mental, the sexual abuse, and then we're gonna let you continue the adulthood, the struggle that you said, what it did to you, and what affected later on, and then towards the healing, how you conquer that, and how you can share, with the people what you have been doing. But I, this is it's like thousands of sentences that I cannot describe, what you have been through, from, like you mentioned, the childhood abuse when you were 6 years old to 12 years old, that you were forced to date someone, and 13 years old that you were started being raped, and 14 years getting pregnant. A regular person can hardly imagine that. And I just, I cannot believe it. If it wasn't for your, strong will, and that voice that you heard, your guardian angel, you think was your brother, I think that was what kept you here for today, for serving the purpose to help others. Like you said, I don't want others to go through what I have been through.
This isn't a house, and it's definitely not a home. It's a prison. The shackles may be invisible, but they are still very real.
What did you say to me? hide from me.
We all wonder why the victims of abuse just don't leave. It's simple, really. You can't leave if you don't have a place to go. Hope Pigs Global will be that place. If you need help or want to find a way to help, visit hopepigsglobal.org. The end of abuse starts here.
All right, so we're back. Hello, everyone. So this is the Miss Texas Show. This show is sponsored by Hope PYX Global. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that serves people from all backgrounds who are victim survivors and families of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault. And this show, we have the military time as well as the Beautiful Ashes segment. If you would like to be a guest of the show, you can email us at msusatexas@gmail.com. It's missusatexas@gmail.com. Or you can also send us a direct message on Facebook with the same name, MSUSA Texas. So without further ado, welcome Lisa again. So thank you so much. You know, like you said, oh my God, this is like a combination of multiple trauma. And so people, for those they have not been through that, this is just like, you know, it's like listening to reading a book, listening to a novel, ebook, or watching a movie. But you have actually been through that. And look at you today, you are thriving, just like you said, you know, in your bio, that you went from surviving to thriving. And so tell us about the audience about, you know, the damage that could possibly do to a child. You know, we've all heard about this ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. So, you know, what kind of damage could be done to a child?
When they go through trauma and abuse, you know, it definitely, you know, I talk about developmental disabilities because, you know, what happens to the brain, especially a child's brain, is that goes into like, I want to call it safety mode. I always say that's like a safety mode. The brain goes into overdrive, goes into safety mode, and it blocks things out to try to protect. But in the process of that happening, what happens inside the brain, they call it a misfire. So your brain grows from bottom on up and it goes into stages. So when it's disrupted by trauma and abuse, it changes everything. It changes the way you develop, it changes the way you think, it changes the way you process. It damages a lot of different aspects inside, you know, inside the mind. So as you're growing older and you're struggling, and even in relationships, you know, it changes that as well. So it does do a lot of damage. And then to, as an adult, start to recognize it and what it is, and then work with it, not against it. And it's all different learning, you know, different learning tools, and everyone's different. So, you know, what works for me might not work for somebody else, but, you know, to recognize what's happened to you and recognize what your disability can be at that moment is what helps you overcome. But definitely, you know, the child who is abused, the child who is, you know, it's not always by the hand, by the words, by the emotion, you know, all that abuse and trauma in someone's life. Like I had trauma of losing my brother and then dealing with a sick mom. All those things play out in a very, you know, a very damaging, very sad way, because it really made it so much more difficult for me growing up, having, you know, all these things. And once again, I call it the blank area, the dark area, because you can, here's an example. I would be in the classroom and the teacher's speaking, and all of a sudden I'm like, they called it daydreaming. They always say, oh, she's daydreaming, but I wasn't daydreaming. You go into like this fog to where everything just becomes dark, and you just can't even focus or hear or think, and you're almost like frozen in time. And then all of a sudden something clicks and you get back into wherever, you know, you come into play. So it could be 20 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, but whatever that time frame, that's lost. So that is the damage that is done from a child who's been abused.
Wow. I was going to ask you about the relationship part of the damage, but since you mentioned now, so tell our audience, and obviously you are, grandma of three grandkids. Again, you're so young. So, share with us, what kind of damage to relationship, if you can go a little bit into details. And I understand it's not like one path fits all, but share with us a little bit how you deal with it.
Yes, I mean, damaging, the damage of how you perceive, relationships with other people. So of course, holding it all in silently. So now, no matter what relationship you're involved in, you're not fully truthful because you're so damaged and so hurt. You can't get those words out. And for myself, I speak for myself. I couldn't get the words out. I couldn't say them. So you're always living, again, two separate lives. You have your damaged past and you have your present relationships. So it makes it harder to connect on different levels. It makes it hard to, always being on the defense. That's another thing that happens for somebody who's been abused. They're always on the defense. They're always feeling like someone's judging them or looking at them a different way. And, harder to get along with people. And that's the basis of, having good relationships with people, whether it's a significant other or work or just friends, is to be open and honest and to be understanding of somebody else. But when the person's damaged and can't see beyond that little piece right there, which is a big piece, it's very hard to have successful relationships. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of self-work. And that is a lot of what I've done. Once I broke the silence, it was really all about self-work and healing and overcoming.
Right. Yeah. Like you mentioned, we worked with NASCA and also like different groups, and we had one time talked about the Boy Scout of America and all those people who came front forward, and those that happened like many many years ago, and those people, the damage that has caused to their lives, that could be just the inability to carry on a stable relationship, let alone even like getting married, having a child or children. So this is very, significant in a person's life. And you mentioned about recognition. Unfortunately, when a person is in that, especially during the 70s, people are not educated about it. I'm glad that people are breaking the silence and you are leading this as well. And people are getting more information about that. So at least, they have the opportunity to be exposed, to learn about what is happening to them. And again, I really think that the healing journey is different from one to another. It's never a comparison. Once it's worse than the other. It's a different stage. It's a journey.
It is.
So, but when they're ready, right? So they will go seek the help, because it really needs like a whole army of people to support them together.
Oh, that's so true. And my motto, and I always say it, and I have my bracelets that I wear, and it says embrace the journey, because that's how I feel. Because the healing journey for everybody is different. It looks different, it feels different. We all have that core bonding of being abused and what we've been through, but everyone's healing journey is unique and it has to be at their pace. And like you said, when they're ready, when the person's ready, and that's the only way it can happen successfully. The person needs to be ready, and that's different for everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. While we're at it, I wanted to mention that we have a support group called Survivors Against Violence Everywhere. We'll be putting the link below so that it's open to everyone that is, a survivor, as well as their family, their friends who want to support them. The goal is to provide a safe environment so that everyone can share their stories like what we are doing, and support each other with hope, love, and unity, like what you're doing as well. So, for those who are what we mentioned, their friends, family, who want to support them, but it's I've worked with different people, and sometimes it's not like they don't care. They really care, but they might be walking on eggshells. They don't know what could be a trigger. It could be, something that they do with just out of the blue, and something that they say. So what advice would you give to those people who really wanted to support a person who is a survivor, but how can they do that?
How can they do that? Yes, My husband is classic of an example of somebody who stood by and supported me through this. And it was so difficult for him because, again, you don't want to trigger. You don't fully understand, and you haven't heard the whole story. So every time, you hear something new, it's like, wow, that happened as well. And now you're trying to, understand that. So the best advice I can give to somebody who is supporting someone who's been through trauma is listen, just listen. And I know that's hard because when you hear a loved one tell you such horrific things, like when I shared things with my husband, it broke his heart. He was angry. He was frustrated. All normal responses when you care for somebody. You get all those feelings. And what do you do with them? You have to talk about them. So that's the other thing I could say for someone who's supporting someone who's struggling. Talk to other people. Like you said, a support group. Talk to other people and share your own frustrations and sadness, because you have to get it out as well. But the biggest thing you can do for the person who's struggling is just be there the best that you can, the best that you can offer compassion and love and caring, and just be kind, and know that sometimes if someone's acting a certain way because they've been triggered, it's not truly who they are. That's the abuse coming out. That's the trauma coming out. And it's hard to walk that path with someone who's been through, so much heartache, because you love that person. And at the same time, that person could be saying or doing things that hurt you, the person helping. So it's always good to have your own little support group as you're supporting that person. So it's a big circle, and it coming together. And I think the biggest key to that is just being kind and understand, compassion the best that you can. And definitely get support for yourself through it.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. Yeah, because they're out of the blue and they don't know. Like sometimes it could be like an outbreak of silence. Can be in different shapes or form, and it could be verbal violence, and they can take it personal, even though, like you said, it's not you, it's not me, it's not that person who says that. It's just what they have been through, that a reaction of what they have been through. So it's very hard for the other person not taking it personal. That is great.
And it's true, because that's how I grew up too, like with my mom being sick. So my mom had so many incredible qualities, and she really was a loving, caring woman, but the mental illness overtook that. So as I grew older and I was going through my own healing process, I had to learn how to split it up. It's like decipher what is my mom and what is the illness, who is my mom and what is the illness, and all that stuff. And I had to separate it. And when in doing so, I learned a lot about my mother. I learned a lot of good things about my mother, and I was able to find forgiveness there in that part, because I was able to separate my mom from the illness. And it's the same as when you're helping someone who's healing. You have to separate who is the person. Like my husband, loved me, but he was so torn with what happened to me. It was very difficult for him to process. So splitting it up, separating it, who is the real person, and then there's the abuse and trauma. And when you can split them up and really, get that clarity, then you can move forward and figure it out and find your way. And it is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, because everyone says to me, well, look at you now, you're healed, you're this. Yes, I am healed, and I can say that. Do I have quirks? Oh yeah. And I will always have quirks from my past and certain things and little triggers, but now I understand them. But it takes years, it takes time, and you have to allow yourself that time to heal properly. It takes a long time.
Absolutely. So now let's having you share with us about the adulthood story, including your husband and your grandchildren, how you coping that and what happened afterwards.
Yeah. So, when everything fell apart for me, I was, like I said, married with 3 small children, trying to, live the everyday life and do, what I needed to do. But the past was coming out, and the past was coming out in flashbacks. The past was coming out in nightmares, horrific nightmares. And everything that I was never able to verbalize and share was coming out in those ways. So I was having these horrific flashbacks, and here I am taking care of my children, and all of a sudden I'm hit with a flashback. And now I'm trying to, maneuver through that and stay sane and stay grounded. I have small children. I have a life. I want this life. I've always wanted that life, a husband and family. And I always knew I would give my children what I didn't get. And I have successfully done that. And I'm very proud to say that, because my 3 children, grew up and didn't have to see what happened to me in that respect. Like, I hid it from them. I don't know how I managed to do so, but I did it, and working on myself through that process. But it was very, very hard. It was very scary. And then I had to take the step of sharing my full story with my husband. We were married 10 years before my husband heard my full story. He knew I had abuse. He knew, of course, my mom. He knew my mom very well and knew what her story was, but he didn't know the whole story. And I hit a point where I was like exploding. I had to share it. I had to release it. I did go to counseling. I've been to therapy a couple of different times in my life. Very important to find a good therapist, one that you connect with, to break your story into pieces. So I had to share this with my husband. He was devastated because the abuse I sustained was horrific. It was disgusting. It was just horrendous is the biggest word I always use, because it like I said, so many things happen at one time. It wasn't just one type of abuse. It was all types of abuse wrapped up, and it went on for so long. It wasn't, a very short period of time. It was a very long period of time. So I had to share it with him, and then he had to process that. And his mind was blown. He's like, who are you? Like, the woman that I've married, that I love, and we have a family with, who are you? And it was very difficult for him to maneuver through that as well, hearing these stories, knowing that this is what happened. But by the grace of God, and we just, true love, I chalk it up to true love, because we fought through it together, and he really became a huge support system. He even went to therapy for a little bit to work through those things and learn how to work with me. And we fought hard to hold our relationship together, hold our family together, and working through, the healing journey. And the healing journey has taken me to very dark places, and it's given me great success. And not success in like, oh, I wrote a book, in success that I was able to overcome. And now I'm able to help other people, which has always been another goal of mine, is to share my story, to help somebody else, to help other people, and let survivors know they're not alone. I always say we all have a story. Everybody has a story. And, what we do with it is the magic, is what helps others. And that's very, very important to me. And, I broke that silence by writing my book. I wrote my book through the child's perspective because I wanted it to be viewed that way. I've taken great criticism for writing my book the way I did, because I've had people say it's not clean and crisp enough. And I'm like, abuse is not clean and crisp. Abuse is ugly. Abuse is awful. So I'm going to write this story in the true fashion of how it happened, the child's perspective. Is it graphic? My book is graphic. And I've been ridiculed a little bit about it, but I had to be true to myself. I had to be true to my story. I had to be true to my inner child. And what my inner child told me is, this is the way it should be written. And that's what I did. And I'm proud of my work. And it was a big step in my healing process. So I encourage people all the time to write. You don't have to be a writer to write. You can journal for you. And I've spent my whole life journaling. I started journaling at a young age. When the trauma and the abuse was really difficult, I would go sit in the woods by myself or with my dog, and I would write. And that was another avenue that helped me, because you put those things, words on paper, it validates it. So all these things are all the healing journey, the process.
Wow. Yeah, I know. When I was reading your bio, you talked about that you actually teach like journaling and art therapy. This is wonderful. I don't have experience with art therapy, but I have worked with survivors who do that, and they told me that it's very therapeutical. I know that journaling for me, that's what helps as well. Like you mentioned, how you put the words on the white paper, and it validates that. And I have the same experience. I feel like when I'm done with it, and it's all the weight on my shoulder, it's just all the weight, in my heart, it just get poured onto that paper. Whatever you do with it, it really doesn't matter. Just like you said, some people turn it actually into a book, but sometimes it's just therapeutical. It's a therapy. So
Absolutely, yes. I mean, and I did, like I said, I did it for years. I wrote poetry, wrote, just journals. And I tell people, you can even write, and I won't swear, but I write swear words down. If that makes you feel better, if that gives you the release that you need to move forward, then write that swear word down 100 times if it makes you feel better. When I journaled as a kid, another way that I tried to help myself, to encourage myself to be strong, I wrote on a piece of paper, I deserve better. I deserve better. I wrote it in my journal like 1,000 times. I am worth it. And I was telling myself, and it's a mindset as well, telling myself to stay strong, telling myself that I will get beyond this, and relieving, the stuff inside my mind, and thinking, because I was beaten down. I thought I was garbage on someone's shoe. So by telling myself over and over, I deserve better, I'm worth it, I was self-talking, and that's another good thing about journaling. You're self-talking, to you, to encourage to move forward and to find your healing. And it's a great tool.
yeah, this is wonderful that you mentioned that, because I made the notes. You mentioned that you wanted people to know that they're not alone, that you lived in the silence. Then you mentioned that you were a damaged child, but it's really important that the abuser, the boy that at the time you encountered, unfortunately, he put all those toxic words in you. And remember, again, the audience that you're listening, she was just a child. So it's really hard, even as an adult, to be mentally abused constantly with those words, to make you possibly believe that what he said was true. So it's really important what you're validating yourself. So you know what? I deserve it. I'm worth it. And I'm not what you said you are. So
Right.
this is wonderful. This is really wonderful that you come up with this to validate yourself. And we're also giving out the free ebook from Marissa Pierce called "I Am Enough." You're welcome. I can send you the code as well. So
Yes.
we're gonna put the registration link so you can get the free ebook. And a
Oh,
big shout out to Marissa Pierce for supporting this show and our
yes.
survivors and advocates like yourself. I think this is really important. When I read her book, she talked about putting the lipsticks on the mirror, but for me, I just put all the sticky notes all over. Like I put not just one, I put like 10 of them. I think that's really useful. Yeah. So this is so awesome, like what you shared. And I also want to mention that you brought hope to our audience. You talk about true love and your husband and how you fought through this together. He even had to go through those mental segments. Unfortunately, I have to go seek therapy. So what kind of advice and takeaway would you like to leave to our audience?
You know, life is a journey, and we all have our ups and downs. And the thing I want to tell, the audience today is that regardless of where you've been, you can always make it forward. You just have to really dig deep and be strong. And even at your weakest moments, dig a little deeper, because you deserve it. You deserve better in your life, and you can get there. Ask for support as often as possible. I always tell people, reach out for support whenever you need it. You don't have to go it alone, but fight for yourself. At the end of the day, you got to take care of you, self-care and self-worth, and always hold on to hope, because hope is huge. And when we lose hope, everything seems very dark. You got to hold on to that little bit of hope, and that's what's going to help you over that hump. Look for the next day. Look for the next positive thing. It could be something very minute in your day, but if it's positive, stick with that. Fight with that. Take it with you, and use it for, to push yourself forward. It really is a lot about self-talking, and really working with yourself to become strong. And when you start to get clarity and visualize the future, that's another thing. And that's another thing that helped me. I visualized myself already there. And with that vision is what I pushed towards. not thinking, sitting in the past, pushing towards the future. I visualize being there and being happy and being healthy and finding goodness in life. And I'm here. I've made it. You know, life is hard. Daily grind is hard. Having children, raising grandchildren. My husband and I are raising 2 grandchildren. That's hard. But we're so blessed in so many ways, and you have to find the goodness in every day and the goodness. So, you know, just keep pushing. Just have hope, push, and keep the faith.
Wow, this is beautiful. Visualize where you will be in the future. This is, from Lisa. Thank you again so much. So how can our audience find your book?
Find my book. I always encourage people to go to my website, lisazarcone.net, because all my information about my book is there, my life story, but also I blog and there's poetry. There's a little bit of everything. And my blog, I love my blogs. I love to blog because it's always like what's happening in the world, what's happening, with, mental health and child safety, all the things that I talk about and encourage people to learn about. It's all there. So go to lisazarcone.net. I'm also on Amazon and Kindle and Barnes and Noble, so you can find me there as well. But go check out the website because I think if you like to read, my blogs are very informative.
Thank you so much. We'll be linking Lisa's website under the content section below, so you'll be able to click on that. In the meantime, I wanted to thank you for your time. And once again, happy Valentine's Day to you for, sacrificing this important time, but to share this important cause with everyone. I think that you have so much to offer. I would like to bring you back